Okay, I think we'll get started. Good evening. My name is Kathy McCormick, Board President of the Perrot Memorial Library in Old Greenwich. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program with Rachel Cohen, author of the Austen Years, a memoir and 5 novels. I want to thank the members of the Perrot Memorial Library Association whose generous contributions make programs like these possible. If you're not a member, please consider joining. Details can be found on our website, perrotmemoriallibrary.org. Rachel will speak for about 15 minutes, and then she would love to answer questions. You can submit a question through the chat function at the bottom right of your screen. And we're thrilled to have Barbara Arentru from the Greenwich Pen Women, who is also an author, educator, and host of a radio show, who will help interview Rachel. And now I'm proud and pleased to introduce Rachel Cohen, a professor of practice in the arts and the creative writing program at the University of Chicago. Her essays on artists and writers have appeared in publications including The New Yorker, The Guardian, the London Review of Books, Art in America, Apollo Magazine, and the Best American Essays. Austen Years was named one of the Globe and Mail's best books of 2020 and the LA Times 10 Great Books that got lost in the noise of 2020. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here in this kind of hybrid space, this virtual space, kind of partly in Greenwich, partly in Chicago, where you're all joining me in my study. And it's nice to see a couple of familiar faces and many, many new to me. Thank you for coming this evening. So what I'm going to do is read a little bit from my book and kind of give you a little sense of what the book is. And then I'd love to talk more with you and with Barbara, who's graciously agreed to, who's read my book and agreed to sort of begin the questions. This is what the book looks like. It's called Austen Years, a Memoir and 5 Novels. And it was published this summer by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. And it's a book which maybe if you've read a synopsis, you have a sense, but it's a book which takes place over several years. And it's a combination of a memoir of things that happened in my life in that time and of the reading of Jane Austen that I did, the obsessive reading of Jane Austen that I did in that time, where I just read Austen over and over and over again. In that time, things happened in life. It was a sort of middle of life time. My father died, and we had 2 children. And so there was a sense of life going on and also of things having changed very radically. And it was a time when I was both trying to remember the past and to imagine the future in ways that I hadn't had to do before. So I was kind of lucky to have Jane Austen as an interlocutor in that time. And I found both a lot of solace, but a lot of challenges in reading her. And that's what I tried to bring together in the book that I've written. So the first sentence of the book is, about 7 years ago, not too long before our daughter was born and a year before my father died, Jane Austen became my only author. I began to read her before sleep every night and when I woke in the night. I read her at my desk when I couldn't make progress with the biography I was supposed to have finished writing, and on the slow bus that crossed the river to the OBGYN. I would come to the end of a scene and turn the leaves back to read it again, almost without noticing. I was not sure what to make of my condition. And what I want to read from this evening is first a little part that gives you a kind of overview, and then another little part that has some thoughts, especially about teaching and thinking about bringing books to other people, because I know you're a group of readers and you're all involved in reading groups and in a library. I wanted to kind of bring out that part of reading. So this is another little section from early on. Here is a woman, a reader, in winter reading Persuasion. In the spring, she has a baby. She and her husband and the baby, her father and her mother, all go out to walk together. The next winter, her father is hospitalized. She and her husband and the baby go home for the last week of his illness. She brings Mansfield Park. For her, Mansfield Park is a book of constriction and breadth. Sometimes it seems a painfully muted book. Later, when she has thought more, she will see how in its rooms memory is accompanied by forgetting. The reader's father dies. There is a memorial service at which she and her sister both speak. She comes back to the life she has had. For the first year, she reads Sense and Sensibility, about two sisters who are going through the first year after their father's death. She is struggling to think about her father's death. She and her sister both are. They are planning to have second children whom their father knew nothing of. The reader wants to begin writing again. She unfolds Jane Austen's novels like a map. She is pregnant a second time, and now it is Pride and Prejudice, a book about changing one's sense of time and reading again, that goes with her to the hospital. When the second baby can sit up and the weather is warm enough to take him for a walk, she thinks she's probably done with Jane Austen. She plans to write an essay about reading Jane Austen and mark the conclusion. But they move to a new city. There is an election and the world changes. Only now, two children growing up around them, does she begin to really read Emma, and then again, Mansfield Park. Emma and Mansfield Park are important to each other. She cannot shake the sense that between the two of them, she will find it. Whatever of the past she must retrieve, whatever of the future she must imagine. She will write until she finds it. She tries one way, another way. It will be done this season, next year. 4 years go by. She is always and still reading Persuasion. She loves Persuasion. It is not the most brilliant or elegant or formally demanding, but it seems to know her and all of them so well. It has the depth of dreams, and like dreams, it is incomplete, and she cannot really understand it. That's the end of a section, and I'm going to switch to reading a different section. The book is made of many small sections, and that's of interest to me. I'm interested in mosaics and kind of putting things together in pieces and seeing how things can kind of vibrate across the broken spaces. And that was also of help to me in trying to put together this material, which was kind of quite disparate. There were things which were from my life and things from Austen's life and things that I noticed in her books. And I was trying to keep all of those things kind of running. So moving among them, I needed lots of little sections. So this is a part that's about Anne Elliot in Persuasion, who's one of the great readers in Austen. And there are many of the characters in Austen read, but Anne Elliot, we know her history of reading, and she kind of tells, if you've read Persuasion, she tells Captain Benwick what she thinks he ought to read. He's in mourning, he's lost his fiance, and he's kind of stuck in his mourning. And she says, you've been reading too much poetry, you're reading too much romantic poetry, and you should read something that's more vigorous and that kind of forces you to, like, you should read essays, and you should read memoirs, and you should read history, and that will help you to kind of build yourself back up again and move forward. And in fact, it does have an effect on him. He changes what he reads, and he gets more connected to the world. So it's an interesting example of kind of teaching in the book itself. But it's also a moment where Anne Elliot has some doubts about the advice that she gives. And I kind of like that. In Austen, things are always ambiguous. There's always complexity. So from that section. In Austen, we are often told what a character is reading and how, and it always matters. Characters drawn to lurid or Gothic stories are unformed or unreliable. They want shoring up or reining in. Both lazy characters and rigid ones don't read. Self-absorbed ones read too much or with poor judgment. There is a balance in reading, as in all things. To read in a desultory, uncommitted way shows a want of exertion. To live in books to the exclusion of one's real neighbors, a want of compassion. Although we now think of reading as a generally solitary activity, in Austen's day, people often read aloud to one another. Her family did this nearly every evening. They judged books by how they sounded, on a second reading, a third. Austen's characters learned to read and to reread, and this, mysteriously, significantly, is a part of how they come to say what they mean and to live in the world together. Here is a passage I look for at night. After Anne finishes her conversation with Captain Benwick, which for her has been stimulating and pleasant, she goes back to her hotel room. A hotel room. For me and for a few other women I know, the liberty of a hotel room since having children is like nothing else. And I did think about this when I picked this passage to read, that had I been able to come and see you in person and be in Connecticut, I would have flown there probably, and I would have stayed somewhere, and I would have had this kind of solitude that's very particular of traveling and being unto oneself. Really alone with my thoughts, and made aware by every unfamiliar, impersonal bit of the surroundings that I am unto myself. Anne's days are usually a thicket of domestic obligation, but today she has had a conversation about books that she would never have with her sister or her neighbors. I think I know a related feeling from teaching, a sigh of relief to have spoken some of these inward reflections, quickly followed by the uncertainty that I've said too much, too prescriptively. Often as I walk away from the classroom, I am torn between the feeling of having offered something and cringing and laughing at myself for my presumption. That night in her hotel room, Anne, quote, could not but be amused to have come all the way to Lyme, quote, to preach patience and resignation to a young man whom she had never seen before. Right away, she casts doubt on herself and on the memoirs she has recommended. She can't help noticing that, again quoting, like many other great moralists and preachers, she had been eloquent on a point in which her own conduct would ill bear examination. In an old-fashioned memoir, one by a great moralist and preacher, Anne's conduct would ill bear examination. It would be too small. She's only a woman. She's very ordinary. Very little has happened to her. But in the novel that I am reading, her self-examination is what makes her a kind of friend. If Anne Elliot is almost a writer of her own experience, almost a memoirist, certainly with her own worth and suffering within the novel Jane Austen wrote about her, she becomes this almost writer, or becomes her again, as she comes out of more absorbed grief and into a recognition of what that grief has been. It is she who describes herself and her mournful love for both Captain Wentworth and her mother. Anne's mother has died when she was about 15, I think, 14. And so she's been in a long period of mourning. That's part of why Persuasion is so relevant a book right now. Anne says to a friend, this is a different captain toward the end of her book, that her experience has never been really understood or recorded in books. If you please, she says, no reference to examples in books. Men have had every advantage of us in telling their own story. Education has been theirs in so much higher a degree. The pen has been in their hands. I will not allow books to prove anything. She will instead speak of her own experience, never yet in a book. The speech is now a famous one, though it was quietly uttered. Anne makes a declaration that others may share in when she says that she is a woman, one of those loving longest when existence or when hope is gone. And that speech was one that is really important to me and is a kind of through line through the book, because it's a place where memoir and novel and history kind of join together, and a place where you sort of think to yourself, well, whose experience does belong in the pages of a book and on what grounds? And I love Anne for making that assertion that her own experience, which hasn't been in books, belongs in a way in a book, in Jane Austen's book. And so that was something that I thought about a lot as I was working on my own project. So that gives you just a very brief little introduction to what I was attempting in this book. And now I'd like to have a more general conversation. I think Barbara's going to ask a few questions, and you feel free, if you want, you can type questions into the chat now, or when she finishes, we'll open it to a more general discussion.
Okay. I have one question that I want to start out with, and it's why did you decide that you could incorporate your memoir with thoughts on Jane Austen's books? And actually, I have gotten some answer now, but I'd like a fuller answer of why you read Jane Austen through all that. If anybody's read the book, you know all of what happened to you, and why did you decide to do this?
Yeah, it's a great place to begin. I think there are different parts to the answer. There's a part which is about why Jane Austen was the right writer for me in this time, which is something I'm working on answering all the way through the book. And then there's also a part about why in the writing it came together to try to do these things together. So on the first side, why do I think I was reading Austen in this difficult time? And I should say it was a difficult time and also a wonderful time. I think we were people who had hoped for a long time to have children, and then we felt very lucky when we were able to have children. And so although there was kind of no quiet and all the sort of complexity of having children, we had this sense of great blessing all the way through that early childhood time. And at the same time, it was a time of mourning when my father had died. And I was very close to him. It was interesting to find so much of life in Jane Austen. I think that was a really large part of what drew me to those books. There's a sense of respite and solace, as you and I were saying. There's just a pleasure in reading those books at night before you go to bed or something. There's something very perfect about each sentence, and the sense of like, okay, this now an idea has been clearly expressed and I can just be with that. So I found that very helpful. But it was also kind of later, as I looked back at the books, that I realized that I had been reading them for particular reasons. A little bit in the passage that I read, like the year after my father died, I really read Sense and Sensibility, and that book is about daughters and a mother, where the father dies at the beginning of the book, and then you spend the book kind of with them in the first year of their grief. It doesn't get talked about as a book about grief, but it's there for somebody who wants to think about it. So I think the books lent themselves to my rereading and to my kind of busy and interrupted life. And then how I decided to do the book, I think I wrote an essay. I was just going to write one essay about Jane Austen. I thought that would be plenty. And as I tried to do it, it got longer and longer, and more things came in. And at first I was really trying to keep it mostly about Austen and just a little bit about my own experience. But it turned out that wasn't really, I didn't think that was what would be interesting to other readers, because I thought that a lot of my work is interested in a relationship between two characters or between two people, thinking about what they can understand. And what happened in this book was I gradually realized that I was the reader and Austen was the writer, and then sometimes I was also the writer. And it was between us that the kind of interesting thing was happening. And so I thought, but there are a million wonderful books about Jane Austen, and the thing that would make this in a way its own thing was that relationship would be specific and different, and people would maybe be able to find things about Austen through me. They would see some aspects of Austen that maybe they hadn't seen, that wouldn't interfere with them having their own Austen, but it would add to their sense of Austen.
So that kind of gives me a better idea, because I do see a lot of the parallels that you saw. So going on to my second question, let me see if I can find it now. Okay. What about Jane Austen's books made you want to start reading them and continue reading them? And that also is probably something you've answered, but deeper reading.
Well, one thing that I was thinking about as I came up here, our kids are downstairs. They're watching something, I think, for a few minutes. Like my husband is finishing teaching a class, then he's coming home, he's taking over. I think all of us right now are living a strange combination of like very intense isolation and a lot of interruption. Sometimes the interruption is actually just whoever or whatever is in the household with you, but also there's this sort of interruptedness of like email and text messages and the news and the kind of like the sense of, I think a lot of people, whether they're living alone or in crowded households, are having a hard time kind of reading or feeling like they have space to just think. Like it kind of, there's a sense of a constant kind of activity, whether it's electronic or whether it's the residents of a household. And that kind of is actually quite well understood in Austen. Like, and it was something that I was already experiencing. I mean, I think it's been, of course, much more intense in this pandemic period. And I didn't, when I was writing my book, I had no idea that it would come out during the pandemic and that it would have this other kind of resonance. But my own domestic life in the years when I was writing it had this quality of like intense domesticity and constant interruption. And in fact, that was a lot of what her life was like too. She lived in these intense domestic circumstances in a state of constant interruption. And there are some famous passages in the description that her nephew wrote of what her writing life was like, that she's supposed to have kind of kept notes on these small pieces of paper, and then she would put them under things when people came into the room. And she had this space that she worked in, and it had a door, and the door had a squeaky hinge. And there's some controversy among historians about how accurate this squeaky hinge is, but it's reported in a few places, and I'm confident in its accuracy. And the squeaky hinge, people proposed that they fix the squeaky hinge because it was an irritating noise, and she didn't want the hinge fixed because she wanted to have warning when people were about to interrupt her, like when people were about to come in. And I love that. I think that's so interesting, like that sense that she was so constantly interrupted, and even that she needed the sound of her interruption to be kind of resonant so that she could work kind of around and through interruption. So I was just going to say that I think that that she writes in a way that knows about interruption, and that part of why you can read a little bit of her before you go to sleep at night is that she's making something that you will remember it tomorrow when you come back to it, because she really understands that kind of interrupted life. So I find her kind of exquisite for reading now in this time and all during these recent years.
I know. And when I decided to start reading Pride and Prejudice, I felt that same way. It's like, oh my God, I know what you mean. It's like listening to classical music, you know?
Yeah, there's a kind of quiet about it. And it's like classical music also in the way that you hear the voices, like it has this, I know at least one person who was here took a Pride and Prejudice class that I taught at the 92nd Street Y in December, and that we talked about the interplay of voices and the musicality of the voices in Pride and Prejudice.
Very musical. Very interesting.
It is very musical book.
The whole interaction of that family together is very interesting. But
yes,
let's go on and let's read. How do you think there are parallels between the lives of her characters and your own life? And that kind of, zips right into what we're talking about. The idea, right?
Yeah, I know in some ways, like I just said, it surprises me that that my book became more relevant in this time. I thought that in a way, the thing I was doing was just my own pursuit that happened to be the thing I have been thinking about and working on over these last years. But now everybody's in much more intense domestic isolation, and I mean, I think mourning is a more significant part of all of Austen's work than is generally understood. We think of the books as comedies and as romantic comedies, and they are that. But many of them have elements of sadness, melancholy, difficult memories, attempts to remember and retrieve the past. And Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, and Persuasion all have a kind of somberness that. So the more you talk about the books, the more you think, wait, which are the comedies? Which are the ones that are just only happy? It's Pride and Prejudice and Emma are obviously incredibly witty and delightful books, but Emma, we're told right at the beginning that her mother died when she was very little, and and all the characters have lost at least one parent in Emma, and a couple are orphans. And we tend to just kind of pass over those back histories of the characters and think like, okay, but that's just the backstory, and now this is the funny part in life where we are now. I think those if you kind of take into account the difficulty that those characters have had in figuring out what they ought to do with themselves when they're missing a parent or when their parents are negligent or absent, you see the books as more serious, and you see the kind of struggle towards self-knowledge as something that is recognized as arduous. So I think there's a lot in each of them. And then there are some that just outright have a lot of loss, like Persuasion, where really everybody is in mourning at some point in the book or all the way through the book. Yeah.
So that's definitely, I agree with you. So after reading all of Jane Austen's books, would you say there are some common themes in all of them, and what would they be?
I like to think about them almost like as having different palettes. Like I think I write a lot about painting, and one of the things that I do is I keep a notebook online that's about looking at paintings. And that's also been an interesting thing to do right now during the pandemic when we can't go look at art. So I've been doing this project, and that's been interesting. And maybe that's really geared my attention toward thinking about painting more. And I've been thinking about Austen's sister Cassandra being a painter and what that meant in their family life. And the author Natalie Jenner, who has a book out now, The Jane Austen Society, which is a very fun and delightful book, a novel, has recently acquired a painting that belonged to Jane Austen's father, and she's been sending me some pictures of it. And so you can sort of see this painting that was probably in the Austen household, and that's making me think about like what they thought about paintings and what they were interested in. So I guess I think of the Austen novels as having palettes, and they definitely have very different palettes, like the kind of colors and the brightness of them is quite different. But there is, I think, into your question about common themes, there definitely is in each of them a young woman who has to come to a certain kind of self-knowledge and self-understanding before her life can kind of continue or come to its next stage. That journey is always the central journey of the books. And I think it's much more about that than it is about romantic satisfaction. Like, although there's certainly pleasure in the proposal scenes, or in the sense that she's going to escape from her household and get into having her own household, whatever that's going to be. I think the real satisfaction is in the sense that she has got into some kind of understanding of herself that's going to allow her to act in the world, and that's going to allow her to get heard in the world.
So would you say, this is not a question I thought of before, but would you say that she was for women's rights before people even talked about them?
Yeah, she was. I mean, she was really, it was something that I really learned as I was researching for this book, that there were things that were possible for women in the 18th century that were then no longer possible for women in the beginning of the 19th century. I think we tend to think of rights as kind of historically progressing upward or something toward ever more liberation, but in fact, it's a much bumpier kind of road than that. And in the 18th century, there were a lot of women intellectuals, there were a lot of women novelists, and it was a time of real power for women. There was Mary Wollstonecraft writing The Vindication of the Rights of Women. There was a lot. The Enlightenment was friendly to women intellectuals. I mean, they were still in a tiny minority, and they didn't have access to universities or libraries or anything, so it was still very repressive, but relatively speaking. But then with the Napoleonic Wars and with the changes in socioeconomic life and with a rise of evangelical religion that had conservative views of women, there was a real damping down. So that Austen was actually writing in a time where she felt that women were increasingly constricted. Like she felt like she was not able to do the things that she had anticipated being able to do when she was looking at the women novelists she admired when she was growing up. So she was certainly actively thinking about what it was to be a woman in the world and what chances and possibilities you had. And I could say more about the backstory there. So yeah, I think that's a beginning answer.
That's very interesting. So let's go on. Let's talk a little bit about you. How did you first get into writing, and were you inspired by anyone or anything?
Oh, that's nice too. Yeah, this is my third book, so I've been writing for a while now. My first book was called A Chance Meeting, and it was published by Random House in 2004, I think. So, so I've been a writer for a while. And when I started as a young writer, I wanted to write essays. I've always loved essays. And I've always tried to write about essays together with other art forms and together with biography and history. So I've always written kind of hybrid and somewhat unusual nonfiction. A Chance Meeting is 36 essays, and each is about two different people who met each other in American history, and they all overlap. So they come back and they meet each other in different circumstances. So it starts with Henry James having his photograph taken by Matthew Brady, and it ends with Norman Mailer and Robert Lowell in the Anti-Vietnam War March. And there's there's 30 characters. So there's James Baldwin fighting with Norman Mailer, and there's James Baldwin learning from the painter Buford Delaney, and there's Delaney with W.E.B. Du Bois, and there's W.E.B. Du Bois with William James, and there's William, that you can see the kind of way, the pattern. So that was a formally experimental kind of book, but also a view of history as being between people, kind of as I was saying before. It's a way of thinking about a couple of people at once. And it's sort of an interesting thing about essays that they usually have kind of one point of view, whereas we're sort of used to novels shifting around among characters, but nonfiction, we tend to think of it as having really only one point of view. So it's interesting to me always to try to move among points of view while still writing essays. So that's a kind of through line.
Excuse me, were you done?
No, I was, yeah, please.
Okay, so would you think that you got into writing because you wanted to write essays?
I did. Yeah, it's a little bit unusual. I think there are maybe more people who think like, I want to be a poet or I want to be a novelist.
English teachers would love that.
Yeah, right. I was like, I think the essay is so beautiful. Yeah, I do. I love essays. I really do. So yeah, I think that's really how I came into it. I have for a long time been working on a novel, but that novel too is kind of a hybrid of nonfiction and fiction. So I never get all the way away from the essay and from history.
I got into writing for fiction, so it's
yeah. That's a little bit more usual path. I think nonfiction is growing. I teach nonfiction at the University of Chicago, and I have wonderful students here. And there are some who come kind of to do nonfiction. And I think also something has changed over time, that the memoir and writing in a personal first person kind of way has really grown over the last 40 years enormously. And so I think there are a lot of people who maybe in an earlier generation would definitely have wanted to write novels. Like they would have thought of using their experiences and fictionalizing them and making novels out of them, who now just think, well, I'll just write them. I'll write memoirs and personal essays. And so that's a kind of cultural shift that I think has also shifted some people toward nonfiction. That wasn't my impulse. My impulse was an essayistic, kind of more old-fashioned one.
No, that was interesting because today I just went to a workshop. Two of the people in Greenwich Pen Women did a workshop on memoir writing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a whole other kind of writing than fiction writing or essay writing or any other. I mean, it's even different. I'm a poet too, and I know that I use emotions, but memoir writing is like taking from your gut, it's like dealing with that. So I'm very interested that you got involved with essays. Would you say besides writing that you have any other hobbies?
Sure, I'm glad to answer that. And then for people who are curious about the timing, I think maybe after that we could sort of open it up
Yeah,
and
yeah, sure.
take some questions from, I think I see one in the chat. I do have other hobbies. Many of them are around different art forms. I love music and I play the piano and I spend a lot of time in museums kind of looking at painting. Those are things that then kind of in turn feed my work and my own writing. And I'm inadvertently a gardener, and that too has become something that's kind of important to me. I think when we moved to Chicago 4 years ago from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we had been for a few years before that, and I was in New York for most of my working writing life. So we got increasingly more green space. In New York, I had no green space. In Cambridge, we were upstairs, but the downstairs people had a little garden that we could kind of interlope with. And now in Chicago, we have a garden of our own. It's not that big, but the people who lived here before were wonderful gardeners. And so now wanting to keep going somebody else's beautiful idea of a garden, I've become a gardener. And I really love that. And that's been also very sustaining this difficult year, to have a little bit of green space. And I want to tell you all that we have robins. Robins came yesterday and they're early. They shouldn't really be here yet, but
Really.
yes, very early. And they look cold, they're kind of like, but they seem definite in their ideas. There are 5 of them in our garden, and they had a nest in a tree in our backyard, and they seem to have come back to it. So I feel a tiny bit hopeful that they think anyway that they can make a go of it. And that's I guess that's another thing that I spend my time.
It's great. I love gardening. I love gardens. I don't have a garden now. I live in a place where you can't have a garden, but that's
Yeah.
that's wonderful. And you also walk, right? You do a lot of walking.
Yes, that's well observed. And walking is a real theme of the book, and a thing that I notice in Jane Austen. She always sends her characters on a walk, and they have to walk with somebody else for their books to come to conclusion.
I noticed that they don't ever walk alone. They're always,
Yes.
when they walk alone, they have problems.
Yes, that's right. Though Elizabeth in Pride and Prejudice desperately needs to walk alone in order to sort her thoughts out. So that's
Yes.
good too. Yeah.
Yes. And so let's go on.
Good, Rachel, did you want to answer some questions now?
Yeah, I'm glad to.
Do you want to end this? Because I was going to ask you who your favorite authors were. And there was one, before we do, I want to ask you one, if you want to skip all that. I have one question from the book that I need answered. Okay.
That sounds good. And then I'll answer some of the ones I see in the chat.
Somebody else had the same question. So it's on page 242. You speak of Mr. Knightley. And you also quote Cowper's line as he is looking at the flames as myself creating what I saw. Then you go on to say that Mr. Knightley does not want to create what he thinks he sees from his desires, but to find the medium of imagination, and observing the world is not to eliminate imagination. When I read this, I wasn't sure what you meant. Though I have a broad sense of what you might mean, I would like you to explain exactly what you mean there.
That seems like a good question. And in fact, it actually kind of leads to the first question that Erin Rafferty has asked. So I can kind of talk about them together. Erin's question, you all can see it in the chat if you open your chats. She says she's here as a lover of Austen and also as a secondary classroom teacher. And she is thinking about the sort of question of content and form, and how kind of who is speaking, and kind of how to think about that context. And that actually is related to this sort of question of like how you ground the imagination, which is the thing that Mr. Knightley is interested in that passage. So something that I would say about reading Austen together is like, that's kind of, it's an idea in her books that there's not like, there's not a single person who's right. There's not like one way of, there are people who are more right or who see things more deeply, but there's never just only one point of view and everything else is kind of less good, wrong. You kind of can see that each person has come to their point of view out of their own experiences and from their own observations. And people can get better at observing and thinking, but there's no like single right thing. And in fact, if you look at the conversation, say like Mr. Knightley is almost the closest thing to like the always right. He's like, he has these opinions and they're very clear and he's well reasoned and he's knowledgeable and but when he and Emma are talking about things, it often happens that she's noticed something that he hasn't, or that she brings up something that he thinks, oh, actually, you're not so wrong about that. Or later he'll tell her, I actually did come to think more what you thought. And it's one of Mr. Knightley's virtues, as you see in that part that you were reading out, Barbara, that he refuses to create things. He tries really hard to look and observe carefully the world, and to have his imagination kind of using what he's observing, and not just kind of go into fantasy and kind of fly away into like what he desires or what he wants, but to really pay attention. This is something Mr. Darcy also has to kind of learn and hold himself to. And it's because he does that, and especially because he listens to all the other people in Emma very closely, that he gets a kind of fairly true picture of what's happening, and has more right guesses than many of the other people. So something that I think is great about reading Austen with other people is that you get to practice that. Basically, you too are in a position where everybody's going to be noticing different things. Everybody's going to be identifying a little bit more with one kind of character or another. Everybody's imaginations are going to be running, but by grounding them in the observation of what's actually in the book, the details of the book, you get this nice chance to try to do the thing that the characters themselves are trying to learn to do, which is to sort of balance observation and imagination, and to kind of teach yourself a little bit more about the kind of imagining other people where you really pay attention to those other people, where you don't just assume you know what they think, but you listen to them. And in that way, the fact that everyone in Austen speaks so much, that we get all their direct speech, they get quoted and they talk. It's not Jane Austen's view of them you're getting, it's their own view of them that you're listening to. And that's quite different than some other books. So that's an answer to those two things together.
Do you want to go to the other questions, or do you want to hear more of mine?
I'll keep on with the ones in the chat, but I'm glad you have extras in store.
Okay.
Yeah,
let's go to the chat because some people may not want to stay here that long. Okay, then we could go to the second question.
Mm-hmm.
Can you read that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
I'll read
Marina Senderos says, Ms. Cohen, you touched on the idea of who gets to have their story preserved in a book. And I'm just wondering, what do you think are grounds for someone's story to be worthy of being immortalized? That's a kind of question for any memoir writer, right? I'm looking to see if Marina is in my view. Nice to see you. Right. I think that it's a question that every memoir writer asks themselves, kind of quaking in our boots, like, is it worth putting my own story forward? My own story is not so interesting. Everybody else has had many powerful things happen to them. And particularly in this case, I was writing about a period of life in which things had happened, but kind of ordinary things, quiet things. And how do you decide, okay, that belongs in a book, I'm going to put that in a book. I think that a thing that I try to say to students who are thinking about writing, and in some ways it's an obvious thing, but it's not that obvious, is that it's much more about the way you say things than about what the content is of what's happened that will make it interesting and available to other people. when I'm reading, I'm not measuring other people's books by by the gravity of the experience or by the amount of things that have happened, or it's not quantifiable. What I'm interested in is what they've thought about it and what that lets me think. So in that way, I kind of think, I really do think any person's story is worthy of being immortalized. Each of us comes out with the things that we're able to understand via our experiences. And so as we were just saying, so for some people, the right thing to do is then, write a rock song, or write or build a public installation, or go into government, or all the other things that people do by virtue of their experiences. But if you want to write through those experiences, any story might be the seed of understanding.
Well, I'll just add that that I think the use of memoir can help you in so many ways, and that your family might want to hear about your stories, and you don't necessarily want to be spending hours telling them. You might want to just write them down with them. And a number of people in our group have done that very successfully. And so there's an idea to you.
Yeah, I think that's really, it's valuable, the kind of accumulation of our collective history. That's, and sometimes that's oral history, sometimes that's interviewing people, or sometimes it's writing your own memories.
And I've heard that historians like to use memoirs a great deal.
Yes, they do. They do. I'm always excited if I find one that I can quote from.
Yeah, because they help them understand what people were thinking then. We can go on to the next one. Sophia A.
Mm-hmm.
That one?
Yep. Sophia A says, do I have a favorite Austen book, or one that's resonated the most throughout my life? And do I think that Austen wrote hoping that her novel's lessons on self-growth would continue to be applicable to the social context of future readers? Those are really excellent questions. The favorite book is, I can never quite answer. In some ways, there are different ones for different moods or different periods for me. So there are moments where nothing but Pride and Prejudice will do, and other moments where I really just need to get into Mansfield Park and kind of struggle with Mansfield Park, which I always find somehow the most difficult, but also it necessary. But I guess the one that's been most with me is Persuasion. And that's partly for reasons that I was saying, that it's a more mature point of view, and it's a woman who's really thinking about self-expression in a very particular writerly way. And so it's close to my heart for those reasons. And because it's sorrowful, and I get a lot of sustenance from that. And then to the other question about self-growth, and I do think that Austen was consciously, I think she knew what she was doing. I think she knew she was writing a new kind of novel that had never been written before. I think she knew that nobody had done the kind of moving into characters' heads and having them speaking for themselves that she was capable of doing. She was a very deep literary reader. She was reading all the other writers of her time. She had a lot of literary opinions. She came from a well-educated family, and she read a lot. And so she really knew what she was capable of and what was new about the form as she was employing it. So I think she had some hopes. I think it would have been hard for her to imagine the kind of stature she has now, the way people compare her regularly to Shakespeare, and the way she's kind of just incredibly widespread and constantly being remade into movies. And I don't think she would have conceived of that future, but in a way I wish she could have, because I think that would be satisfying to know. But I do think she hoped that there would be readers who would come to the books maybe from a position of not being sure of their own voices, and who would feel encouraged by the way that the people in her books grow.
I just want to ask a question myself. I was told by someone, I don't know who, but someone told me that Jane Austen is like required reading for some of the naval cadets in the, and, especially Mansfield Park. And I was just wondering if you feel that because of the naval situation in Mansfield Park, which I didn't read Mansfield Park, but I'm going to. Do you think that
It
she
would
was
make sense.
time in getting in discussing all of these naval situations? And why do you think that they're using it?
It's interesting. It's funny that this has happened twice, but I want to answer your question and somebody in the chat at the same time, because there actually is one answer and the questions seem far apart, but you'll see why there's one answer. So Tra Min Nguyen has said, Austen died before she finished Sanditon. How do you think she would have finished that story? Or how would you like to finish that story? Now, I don't know how I would finish the story. I feel like there's not quite enough of it. I can't really imagine. But Mansfield Park is very closely based in the experiences of Austen's brothers, and two of them were sailors. And there's a lot about sailing and being in the Navy that's in Mansfield Park that's directly out of her brother's experiences. And there's excellent work on this by Brian Southam, if anybody's interested. Jane Austen and the Navy, I think, is the name of his highly regarded and definitive book on this. And so she worked very carefully on that material, and her brothers corrected the naval information, and she wrote letters to them saying, can I use the names of the ships that you were on? She lived in the household of one of these brothers, and she corresponded with him every week while he was sailing. And the experience of those brothers really brought Austen the world. They were in the Navy, they were fighting in the Napoleonic Wars, they were both abolitionists, her brothers Charles and Francis. They sailed to catch slave ships after England abolished the slave trade in 1807. So her abolitionism, which she was an abolitionist, her kind of political perspective was deeply influenced by these two brothers, who seem to have been genuinely excellent men and who wrote letters about what they saw. They traveled a lot into the West Indies and the islands. They were part of the British Empire, and they had complex feelings about it. Sanditon was originally called The Brothers. It was a book that was also going to be about her brothers, and the brotherly characters are very important, and the sense of brotherhood is already there in the book. So one thing that I think would be interesting to pursue in terms of trying to figure out how that book would have grown is to look at Mansfield Park and to think about the kind of fraternal relationships and the way that those brought news of the world for Austen. And it was also set at the seaside, and it was meant to be this kind of spa that these people were building, a kind of new place of health. And so I think, again, that the kind of information she got from her brothers, the experiences of living in their households and getting the reports of their sailing activity, I think that would have been important in Sanditon. Sanditon was a name that a later editor gave to the book, but not the name that Austen herself had picked for it. And that's my instinct about what would happen in that book.
Okay, I have one more question that I would like answered. You were a young mother when you did this book. You started out, and I have to give you credit for that, because I've had two daughters, and I know what it's like to have young children. I can't imagine how you had the time and the ability to do so much research, because I have to tell anyone who hasn't read the book that there's at least 4 or 5 pages of research that Rachel has done, and she sprinkles the book with all kinds of quotes and literary references to people that only if you were only had delved deeply into Jane Austen, you would find these people. So I'm very impressed, and I'd just like to know, did you have help?
That's a nice question. Yeah, I believe in being very straightforward about resources because I think it's important to know, and information doesn't just materialize. Um, I um, I think that actually for me, in some ways, this book was a little bit more limited in compass. Some of my previous two books both had lots and lots of historical characters, and I did huge amounts of research to do them. The pieces that I've written for the New Yorker, often it's like 6 months of reading in order to do a piece. And in this case, although I read a lot about Austen and I did in the end do a lot of research, the fact that it was really one writer and one period of history was for me a little bit narrower compass, which I was able to manage. I did not do a lot of research when our kids were tiny. I was reading Austen and I really was not reading anything else. The book took 7 years, so that's a long time. You can, even if you don't have a lot of time to read, you can read over that period of time. I'm a very fast reader. And I, at this point, have 25 years of experience writing historically. So I really have a lot at my disposal. And we did have help in that we had babysitters and we had schools, preschool, kindergarten, school that the kids went to. And my husband does a lot of childcare too, and had to slow down his own writing so that I could get this book done. So there were a lot of resources that helped. And I teach, which is a wonderful thing to do, but I teach part-time, and teaching full-time is a different commitment. So that also gave me some time. I think we have space for maybe one last question. I don't know if there's people in the audience who have things that they want
I
to.
have one more question.
Well, let's see if
Yeah,
somebody in the audience
if anyone
does.
else has another question.
Yeah.
Barbara, Rachel, I wanted to ask you, are you working on another book?
Thanks. Yeah. I'm kind of working on two projects. One is, I'll keep an eye on the chat if somebody wants to put something in. But I'm working on these pieces that my website, I'm going to put it in here. That's where I keep this notebook. And so I've been doing these pieces about painting, and that's for a project that's about painting and time. Experiences of time and looking at painting in different moments in history. I've been working on that for a long time, also in a kind of fragmentary form. We'll see if it kind of comes together. And then I've been working on this novel that I mentioned also for a long time. And I am trying to find a way into that again. So I think that the novel is the next book. But it could be that the other one overtakes it. We'll see. We'll see which one kind of comes to fruition.
And you mentioned that you did a book discussion at the 92nd Street Y on Pride and Prejudice. Are you doing any more of those that would be open to the public?
Yeah, I believe that I'm going to do Persuasion in the spring there, although that's not confirmed yet, but I think that that's the plan. So you could keep an eye out for that in their offerings. Those classes have a charge. They're not free, but they are open to anybody to take. If you wanted to read Persuasion together, I would be delighted. And then I do quite a lot of, public discussions of different kinds. And those are also on my website, or I keep Instagram it's at Rachel Cohen Notebook. And that is a way to find out what I'm doing. I did want to get to these questions. If people have time, I can do that.
A lot more.
So I see one talking about Austen and abolition, which is really important right now. So I would love to address that. And then, also a question about progressiveness and heroines. So once again, our questions may align. Trami Nguyen, thank you for asking about abolition. That was a real discovery for me about doing this project. I liked the political sense I had of Austen, but I didn't really know what her political commitments were. But it turned out that she was very strongly abolitionist, and all her favorite writers were abolitionists. She loved the poetry of William Cowper. He was a very significant figure in writing poems that were politically for abolition. Her favorite essayist was Samuel Johnson, who was an abolitionist. And she really thought about it a lot. And there are a couple of mentions of slavery in the books. It's taken a while to kind of unearth and fill out what she meant by those. I think early on, or I think at the time, contemporary readers of hers knew what she meant, but that knowledge kind of faded. And so then it took a while to kind of reconstitute it. Edward Said kind of led the way. He's a very important post-colonial critic, and he has an essay on Mansfield Park, which started to kind of open up the question. And then as people looked into it, they found that it was obvious that her brothers were abolitionists, that they were. So Said says, like, I don't think she was probably an abolitionist, but it does seem like she has a kind of anti-slavery attitude here. But she was openly and avowedly, and so were her brothers. This experience that they had of catching slave trading ships after 1807 was really significant. Like, they wrote letters describing the conditions on the ships. And so she was very aware of the specific and gruesome details. And she wrote about how she loved the work of this abolitionist historian, Thomas Clarkson, whose famous book is a history of the British slave trade. And she wrote a letter to Cassandra saying she was kind of in love with this writer. So we know she really thought about it in a lot of specific detail. And if you want to learn about it and think about it, then Mansfield Park is the book to read. In it, Fanny Price asks her uncle in that book, the owner of Mansfield Park, is a person who owns slaves. He owns a plantation in the West Indies, and it's made explicit. And Fanny Price, the young heroine of that book, asks him about the slave trade. And it's a very interesting and important scene. There's a lot written about it. If you want more of my information about it, I wrote a piece for the New Yorker that's publicly available that is about Austen, reading Austen in our times, reading Austen right now. And there's quite a lot about the abolition question and about Mansfield Park in that essay. So that would be a place to start, and that would lead you to some of the other things that you might be interested to read. And then Carrie Groan asked about heroines and who might be most progressive. And I guess in a way, the part that I read to you about Persuasion, about the way Anne Elliot speaks for herself and asserts her own experience, there is a kind of progressiveness about that. But in other ways, Anne Elliot is very held back, very restrained, very quiet. And so there are things to be said for some of the other heroines like Elizabeth and Emma, who just speak for themselves and are just full of ideas and witty and tell people what they should do and put them in their places. And that is kind of delightful and inspiring, I think, for people who are trying to find their own voices. And I think there are important things to be said even for the really quiet and restrained heroines like Fanny and Anne, who have a real depth of understanding. It's important to recognize how powerful quiet people are and how much they add to the world, even if they're not telling you what they think all the time. Probably in our really noisy time, we value outspokenness, but certainly there's a lot of power and reflection and quietude. So it would be hard to choose the most progressive.
Does anyone else have a question? One more, maybe? Oh, step away. No, thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming. And somebody asked me what my second book is, so I can answer that. And I think Barbara had planned to ask me about writers that I like. That's usually a nice way to finish.
I was going to ask you about that.
So I'll do that, and then I'll let you all go, because I'm sure you have busy lives, and I'm sure my kids have only got so much more too. My second book is called Bernard Berenson, A Life in the Picture Trade, and it's a biography of an art critic and art historian who, it's also really a story about prejudice and money. It's about being poor and Jewish and not being able to become a professor or an intellectual, and kind of finding a way to be part of cultural life by becoming a slightly shady art critic and trader with a lot of money and a beautiful collection in Italy. And it's also a way of thinking about how different paintings came to the United States and kind of became canonized. And it's largely about the work that Bernard Berenson did in concert with the women in his life who were amazing, like Isabella Stewart Gardner and Edith Wharton, and the incredible director of the Morgan Library, Belle da Costa Green, who was African-American and passing as Portuguese. And so there are a lot of, again, really interesting characters to think about in that book. And things that I'm reading Ralph Ellison right now and finding that really stimulating. And I just started a book by Elsa Morante called History, which is a novel that also has oral history in it and is about World War II. She's an Italian writer. I'm often reading historically, I'm often reading looking back, but I do also read a lot of contemporary work and admire a lot of contemporary writers. I guess I recently read Elizabeth Rush's Rising, which is a powerful and important book about environmental change. I'm interested in using oral history as part of narrative. So those are some things.
I have to say, I'm just thrilled to have been able to speak with you. And all of my questions have been answered. You're very thorough. And I think everyone else has had their question answered, because I don't think there's been a lot of thank yous and people telling you what a good program this is. And I have to say it was excellent meeting you. And I have to tell also that anyone who hasn't read the book should definitely read the book. It's a very meaty book. That's what I would say. It took me a long time to read because I had to stop after a lot of passages and think about them. So, that's what I would say. And it was very much like reading Jane Austen, because you have to do a lot of that with her book. So
thank you, Barbara. And thank you so much, Rachel, for taking the time to be with us. And we'll send a follow-up email reminding you that Rachel's books are available to check out at Perrot Library or to purchase at our friends at Diane's Books. And we'll also send a follow-up with some of the your essays, links to the essays that you've written.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Kathy. You approached me a long time ago. I really appreciate the work you did to bring this program to fruition and to bring me to Greenwich. And Barbara, thank you for the interview and reading my book carefully.
I hope one day we get to meet in person so that you can autograph my book.
Great. Yes, I have many books to sign when we finally get through this pandemic.
Maybe we could meet in a Starbucks somewhere in New York City.
Thank you, everyone who joined us tonight, and we'll be sending up a follow-up email soon. Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you, Kat.
Bye, all. Many thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.